There's something almost magical about pulling a loaf of artisan sourdough bread out of the oven. No matter how many loaves I bake, it never gets old. But when you're first getting started with sourdough baking, it can be intimidating and frustrating trying to figure out how to achieve a really good loaf. Today I'm going to teach you how to pull off a really good artisan loaf, even if you're fairly new to the world of sourdough baking. First, I'll go over the 4 most important factors to sourdough success, and then I'll walk you through the process step by step. Okay, let's dive in. When it comes to sourdough, there are so many factors that affect the final loaf. However, if you dial in just these 4, you'll have a really good chance at baking an amazing loaf. The first factor is starter health. This is probably the most important factor of them all. If you have a starter that's in poor health, you'll have a hard time coaxing good bread from it. I'll discuss signs of a healthy starter more in a bit. The next factor is gluten development. In order for your loaf to maintain its structure and have a great oven spring, you need to adequately develop the gluten. There are many ways to do this, but for now, just follow the method outlined in this recipe and you'll be good to go. You can learn other more complicated methods later on, so don't get bogged down by all of the options. The third factor is good flour. If you use poor quality flour, you may find it difficult to properly develop the gluten in the dough and you'll be left with a sticky mess. My recipe calls for about half bread flour, half all-purpose flour, and as long as your bread flour has at least 12% protein content, you should be good to go. I like the King Arthur flour organic bread flour. And the final factor is proper bulk fermentation. It can take months or even years to learn how to perfectly ferment sourdough, but you can get really close even if you're new to sourdough if you carefully follow the method outlined in this video. Now let's go over the simple ingredients that you'll need in a little more detail. 300 to 375 grams of room temperature water. Now the reason I gave a range for the amount of water is because this recipe will work at different hydration levels. A high hydration loaf can result in some nice, light, airy loaves, but the dough can be more difficult to work with. I recommend starting out at the lower amount of water for your first few loaves and then graduating to a higher and higher percentage level as you become more comfortable with this recipe. I'll have examples of some different hydration percentages at the end of this video. It's best to use filtered water or at least non-chlorinated water. You can use warmer water to speed up the fermentation, but you don't want to go over 105 degrees Fahrenheit or you'll risk killing the yeast in the starter. However, the temperature that I recommend is room temperature or a little warmer for this recipe. 100 grams of active 100% hydration sourdough starter. You want an active starter that has been fed 4 to 12 hours previously, has at least doubled in volume, and is nice and bubbly and still close to peak fermentation. 300 grams of all-purpose flour. Like I mentioned before, you'll be using about half all-purpose flour for this recipe. This helps to keep the cost down since bread flour typically costs more than all-purpose. After and only after you're comfortable with this recipe, you can start experimenting with replacing some of the all-purpose flour with whole wheat flour. 200 grams of bread flour. But to ensure that your dough has enough strength, you'll be using bread flour as well. 2 teaspoons of salt. I use unrefined sea salt, so you might want to reduce the amount a bit if you use table salt. Okay, let's discuss your starter in a little more detail. Using an active, healthy starter is super critical for this recipe because it doesn't use any commercial yeast. Your starter should be at minimum 2 weeks old if you made it from scratch, preferably at least a month old. It should be doubling consistently, be nice and bubbly, and not smelling overly acidic. If you store your starter in the refrigerator when not in use, you'll want to feed it peak to peak 2 to 3 times before using it in this recipe. Peak to peak feeding simply means feeding your starter soon after it doubles or reaches peak fermentation. This prevents your starter from getting too acidic and weak. Quick tip, you can mark the height of your starter on your jar with a rubber band so that you can easily keep track of how much it has risen. Important note, I feed my starter at 100% hydration, which means I feed it equal weights, not volumes of flour and water. If you keep your starter at a different hydration percentage, feed it at 100% hydration for this recipe. Now, before we truly begin, let's go over some helpful equipment. A Dutch oven. Hands down, a Dutch oven is the best way that I have found for a home cook to achieve a lovely bake. It's totally possible to get great results with an open bake, but the Dutch oven is so much easier. You don't have to deal with pouring water into your oven to create steam, since the Dutch oven traps all the steam that you need. If you're planning on doing a lot of sourdough artisan bread baking, I highly recommend getting a Dutch oven. Mine is a 6.6 quart Tramontina that my mom bought me years ago, and sadly it's no longer available, but I'll have some other options linked in the description. parchment paper. This is what you'll use to transfer your dough to a hot Dutch oven. I use unbleached parchment paper, but you can also purchase reusable silicone mats. Banneton baskets. For this recipe, I like to use either the Bulka 500 gram oval banneton or the small round banneton basket. The oval basket is about 10 inches long, and the round basket is 8.4 inches in diameter. This is technically a little small for this size of loaf, but it still works. You can use a regular bowl for the second rise, but I find that it doesn't let the dough breathe properly, and it's more likely that the dough will stick to the tea towel. Speaking of which, you don't have to line your banneton baskets with a cloth, but I like to anyway to ensure that the dough doesn't stick. I've had loaves stick to a proving basket before, and it is not fun. I like these linen tea towels from the brand Magic Linen, and like all this other equipment, I'll have it linked in the description. A bread lawn. While you can simply use a really sharp knife to score your loaf, a bread lawn makes it so much easier. I like to use this UFO lawn by Wire Monkey. While it's totally possible to make sourdough bread with cup measures, it's a lot less messy and more accurate to use a scale. If you're going to be baking a lot of sourdough bread, I definitely recommend getting one. Oven gloves. Working with a hot Dutch oven comes with a risk of burns, so I highly recommend using oven gloves or oven mitts when you're transferring the dough to and from the hot Dutch oven. Okay, now we can truly begin the process of making the dough. First, we'll perform a fermentolyse. And what is a fermentolyse, you might ask? It's simply the process of mixing together the water, starter, and flour and letting it sit to allow the water to start absorbing the flour and the starter to begin the fermentation process. Now, many sourdough recipes call for an autolyse, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, where you mix only the flour and water together first. However, I absolutely despise trying to mix starter into the dough, so I compromise and do a fermentolyse instead. Okay, mix together the water, sourdough starter, and flour in a large bowl until a shaggy dough forms. I like to use a spatula or dough whisk here. I'm sure a wooden spoon would also work, but it can be more difficult to clean. Quick tip, I highly recommend weighing your water into your bowl, adding the starter, and then giving just those two a good mix. It's so much easier to get the starter evenly distributed if you mix it with just the water first. Cover the dough with a damp tea towel or plastic wrap, or a lid if your bowl comes with one, and allow it to rest for 30 minutes. As you can see, the dough will soften and relax even after just half an hour. After the fermentolyse is complete, it's time to add the salt. Sprinkle it over the top of the dough. The reason you don't add the salt in the first step is because salt can slow down the fermentation process. So adding it later gives the dough a bit of a fermentation head start. However, some sourdough bakers go ahead and add the salt in the first step. It's not something that will dramatically change your loaf, but I don't mind adding the salt in later, so I go ahead and do that. Now grab small portions of the dough and pinch and pull them every which way to start to incorporate the salt. Do you see now why some bakers prefer to add it in at the beginning? Now it's time to perform a series of stretches and folds, which will help to develop the gluten in the dough. I like to have a bowl of water handy to wet my hands so they don't stick to the dough. Grab one edge of the dough, pull it up as far as you can without it breaking, and fold it over to the other side of the dough. Repeat with the other 3 corners of the dough. You've just performed the first set of 4 stretch and folds. Allow the dough to rest for 15 to 45 minutes and repeat the 4 sets of stretch and folds. You'll be performing a total of 6 stretch and fold sequences with 15 to 45 minutes of rest between each sequence. You can wait just 15 minutes between the first 3 sets of stretch and folds, but you'll want to let the dough rest and relax longer as the gluten develops more. You'll be able to tell if the dough needs a longer rest between stretch and folds if it doesn't stretch out very easily. This whole process of stretching and folding will take around 2 to 3 hours. The goal is to develop a dough that is nice and stretchy. If your dough achieves a really stretchy consistency after just 4 to 5 sequences, you can leave off the last sequence. And if your dough still isn't coming together after 6 sequences, you can add on an extra sequence or 2. Now the dough has already been fermenting during the stretch and fold process, but now it's time to finish the bulk fermentation. Place the dough in a proofing container. I highly recommend using a container with straight sides so that you can clearly see how much the dough has risen. This Cambro dough container is really handy, but I've also used this Pyrex glass measuring cup. If you use a container with slanted sides, it's going to be more difficult to tell how much the dough has risen. Now, even though this measuring cup has slanted sides, it does have markings, so that kind of eliminates the problem with the slanted sides. Now let the dough rise at room temperature, a warm spot in your kitchen is great for this, until it has doubled or nearly doubled in volume. I like to proof my dough at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius. Now this final bulk fermentation is a critical step when it comes to the quality of your loaf. An under-fermented loaf will result in an inferior texture, and over-fermenting the dough will also result in a less than ideal texture. There are other more complex and more precise methods of determining the perfect fermentation, but this one is really simple and it will get you most of the way there. You can also perform the poke test. The dough should spring back slowly and not quite fully fill back in when poked. Or give the proofing container a little shake. The dough should be jiggly and have some large air bubbles. These 2 tests are more to confirm that the fermentation is complete and shouldn't be considered sole indicators of completion. By the way, if you have a really warm kitchen, you may want to only allow the dough to rise 80% of the way to doubled before moving on to the next step. However, I find that a 100% or nearly 100% rise works well in a chilly winter kitchen. After the bulk fermentation is complete, it's time to shape the dough. You're going to start with a pre-shape and then a bench rest. Generously dust a tea towel with flour. You can use either all-purpose flour or rice flour. Place the tea towel inside the Banneton basket. For the pre-shape, lightly flour your work surface and gently dump the dough out onto it. Now wet your hands to prevent sticking and begin to shape the dough. There are several ways to do the pre-shape, and here's one method you can use for a batard or oval-shaped loaf. Grab the 4 edges and fold them into the middle one by one. This dough was a bit higher hydration, so it was trickier to work with. Now grab the 2 long edges and pull them to the middle and stitch the seam together. Then roll up from the short end and roll the loaf along your work surface to create surface tension. Set aside to rest for 30 minutes. This is what is known as the bench rest. After 30 minutes, the loaf will flatten and relax somewhat. Now it's time to do the final shape. Turn the dough so the smooth side is down. Start to shape into the final desired shape, which was a batard here. Stitch the seam to help it stay sealed. Flip and roll across the counter for some final shaping. Place the dough smooth side down in the prepared proofing basket. Stitch the seam to help the loaf hold its shape. Dust the dough with flour and fold the tea towel over the dough. If your proofing basket already has a built-in liner, you can use a reusable shower cap type cover or a clean plastic bag to cover your dough. Transfer the dough to the refrigerator for 12 hours. The process for shaping a boule or round loaf is simpler. Gently grab the corners of the dough and pull them towards the center, starting to create a ball. Flip the dough over so the smooth side is on top. Cup your hands around the dough and gently roll it over your work surface, tucking the dough under itself and creating surface tension. Continue rolling the dough over the work surface until a smooth ball forms. You can gently pop any large bubbles that appear on the dough. Lightly dust the dough with flour and cover with a tea towel. Allow to rest for 30 minutes. If you're shaping a boule or round loaf, you can simply repeat the process of rolling the dough across the surface while tucking it under itself. You should end up with a smooth, taut ball. You can do this with just your hands or use a bench scraper to help. Place the shaped dough upside down in the prepared proofing basket. Stitch the dough closed to create even more surface tension and further shape it. Dust the underside of the dough with flour. Fold the tea towel over the top of the dough. Transfer the dough to the refrigerator to cold ferment for 12 to 20 hours. The next day, or after the cold ferment, it's time to bake your artisan sourdough bread. Half an hour before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 degrees Celsius and place an oven-safe Dutch oven into the oven to preheat. Make sure that the lid of your Dutch oven is oven-proof to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 Celsius. After the oven and Dutch oven have preheated for at least 30 minutes, gently invert the loaf onto a sheet of parchment paper. Score the loaf with a razor blade, sharp knife, or bread lame. Carefully transfer the loaf along with a piece of parchment paper to the preheated Dutch oven. Again, I highly recommend using oven gloves or oven mitts to prevent burns. Turn the oven down to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 232 Celsius and bake the loaf covered for 30 minutes. Remove the lid of the Dutch oven and bake for an additional 20 minutes or until the bread is deep golden brown and reaches an internal temperature of 205 degrees Fahrenheit or 96 degrees Celsius. My bread is always perfectly baked at 30 minutes covered, 20 minutes uncovered, but everybody's oven is a little bit different. To ensure that your bread is done baking, you can use a thermometer to check for doneness. Transfer the loaf to a wire rack to cool for at least 1 hour before slicing. Look at that crispy crust. By the way, if you're scoring a boule, an X pattern works a bit better than just one along one edge. Now let's see some example crumb shots. Here's what the crumb structure of the round loaf looks like. I used 100 grams of hard white whole wheat flour for this one, and it was 75% hydration. Here's what the crumb structure of the batard looked like. This one was all white flour, 75% hydration, and it was slightly under-fermented, but close. Here's another all-white flour batard, 75% hydration. I pushed the bulk fermentation longer and the results were a better fermentation. Both loaves were delicious, by the way. And here's a loaf that was shaped into a boule and made with 50% hard white whole wheat flour and 50% bread flour at 75% hydration. I think this one was my favorite when it came to flavor. Finally, here's an all-white flour boule at 60% hydration. The crumb isn't as open, but the dough was much easier to work with. So if you're just getting started, I would recommend using the lower amount of water. Now, in my opinion, the best way to cut a sourdough boule or any sourdough artisan loaf is to first cut it in half, then flip it so it's sitting cut side down. Then slice from the bottom down to the cut edge. This cuts down on smashing your loaf. Plus the slices are a more appropriate size for your toaster. Now the way I like to store my sourdough loaves is in a plastic zipper top baggie at room temperature. It will last for around 5 days like this. For longer term storage, you can place it into the freezer. It should keep for at least 6 to 8 weeks. So that's how to make an amazing wild yeast loaf in a Dutch oven. If you have any questions, make sure to leave me a comment and I'll do my best to answer it. And make sure to check out my sourdough starter feeding guide to ensure that you're keeping your starter strong and healthy for bread baking. It hurts the most. First, I'll go over the You can wait just 15 minutes per turn. And By the way, if you have a really warm kitchen, you can use a thermometer to test that. Plus the slices are a more appropriate size. Plus the size at different because